All right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. So in today's episode, we are talking about breath hold training for high altitude mountaineers and hikers. And we're going to be diving into this type of training that's becoming more and more popular and exploring a few of the claimed benefits and whether it's something a mountaineer or a hiker may want to apply in their training. Now, as I said, breath hold training is just becoming more and more popularized in the world of mountaineering and hiking. If you've ever explored the rabbit hole of breathing training before, you've probably come across this. And you'll see a lot of coaches, a lot of big names talking about doing videos and blogs and articles and all of this. Now, the whole topic of breath hold training or apnea training or however you want to phrase it, it is a very, very murky subject because realistically, it's very, very niche and there isn't a huge amount of research out there. And of the research out there that's looked at this type of thing, a lot of the conclusions or the information or the research is just conflicting. And it makes sense because this is a very, very niche topic. But because of this, because there's no real consensus, there's no real massive body of evidence to show one way or another, whenever we find one of these fields or topics in the world of training, it's kind of like the wild, wild west. And when it comes down to breath hold training, because it is quite murky, we see a lot of people out there who are making big, big, big claims about this type of training in the world of hiking, mountaineering, endurance performance, and high altitude. To give you a few examples of this before we even get into everything, I want to share with you a few direct quotes that I've pulled from articles and videos on this subject. People have said that breath hold training is proven by published scientific research to increase hemoglobin concentration in your body. It will prepare your lungs and legs for exertion at high altitude. This will get you more acclimated to less oxygen being available in your bodies. In as small as 3 sessions of this, I've noticed it makes a huge improvement to my ability to perform at high altitude. Your body will make physiological adaptations at no matter what elevation you are training as if it's already at altitude. Breath hold training will improve respiratory muscle strength. These exercises promote strength and endurance of your respiratory muscles, stimulate the release of EPO, which boosts red blood cell production and enhances oxygen carrying capacity. One of the best ways to prepare your body for this type of exertion. This can simulate altitude training at home. We demonstrate that breath holds have the potential to pre-acclimatize or avoid altitude sickness entirely. Now, those are some pretty big claims, and people are bold as brass saying these things online. And I'll be honest, a lot of what you look into this, and when you dive a bit deeper, a lot of what people are saying doesn't really stack up. Not that this type of training doesn't have its own benefits, not that this type of training doesn't have its place in the right context, but as I said, it's kind of like the wild, wild west. People are just saying things and it doesn't really stack up. And that is a bit of a problem because when we have so many people out there who are just making content on this subject and they're just saying all of these things and they're kind of saying the same information again and again and again, anyone who is interested in this subject is only going to come across one side of the story. They're only going to come across people saying this is the best thing in the world for a high altitude hiker or mountaineer to do, and it's absolutely going to change your life at high altitude or whatever it may be. And in all honesty, from what I've seen, there isn't really a counter argument to this. There isn't really anyone out there saying, well, it may improve this, but you know what? It's a bit of a stretch here. There isn't more context or nuance to this. And, if you're a hiker or mountaineer who looks into this subject, it can lead you down, maybe a potentially slightly misguided path, which isn't ideal. So that's why I'm covering this today. It's something I've sat on for a while. I don't particularly love this topic or whatever it may be. I don't particularly consider myself a specialist when it comes down to this type of training or whatever it may be, but I just feel like there's just no context and nuance to the conversations around this subject. So I want to change that a little bit. I want to explore it. I want to dive into it and just give a little bit more information. And essentially, we're going to be diving in today some of the claims people commonly make about this, and just so there can be, I guess, a bit more of a broader scope of information available to hikers or mountaineers who may be looking at this. So what we're going to be covering today, we're going to be covering just what breath hold training is and the theory of breath hold training. We're going to be diving into the claimed benefits of breath hold training as it relates to hikers and mountaineers. So specifically, we're going to look at it for high altitude preparation and just look at the questions. Can it be considered another form of altitude training? Does it help reduce the risk of altitude sickness? Can it pre-acclimatize you? We're going to look at respiratory muscle strength. We're looking at carbon dioxide tolerance, EPO release, and also increase in fitness. So all of those things that people will commonly say, whether it stacks up or not. Now, fair warning, this is going to be a bit of a long subject. It is going to be a bit more detailed than usual and a little bit more finicky. So for a lot of people, you may find this boring. So if you're not interested in breathing training at all, if you're not interested in like the details or whatever, maybe just skip to the next one. But if you are interested in this subject, I think it is going to be quite valuable. So with that being said, what is breath hold training? Now, essentially where breath hold trainings come from is a long time ago, people realized free divers are pretty interesting. Now, free divers who go under the water don't use oxygen or whatever it may be. They literally hold their breath for the sport. They spend a long time holding their breath. Now, they've been observed, elite free divers or regular free divers had been observed to have a number of different adaptations in their body from their sport, which may potentially be beneficial in other sports. And people looked at them and were like, wow, they have all of these things going on. If we could replicate this for a normal sport on land, this can be really beneficial. So the whole idea around breath hold training involves combining exercise with breath holds, holding your breath, to try to produce some of these adaptations in the body. Now, there are a lot of different ways people train breath holds. There are probably dozens of different approaches to this. Now, the main one, which is often promoted to mountaineers and hikers, and the one we're going to be mainly talking and focusing on today, is essentially where you hold your breath after an exhalation. So you breathe out the air in your lungs and you hold your breath. Now, other people promote where you have a big breath in and you hold your breath. Other people promote doing hyperventilation and then holding your breath. We're not really talking about those ones today because I think they're not typically talked about for hikers and mountaineers, but more this holding your breath after exhalation. And people will do this if they're just sitting around and sitting in a chair. They may do this while they're walking and do these breath holds as they're actively walking, and also can build up to higher intensity exercise. And when people are actually doing running or intervals or sprints and holding their breath. So there's different levels to this and layers to this. Now, the kind of really, really basic idea around this is essentially if you hold your breath after a passive exhalation, this is going to cause two things in the body. Number one, it's going to cause an increase in carbon dioxide in your body because we typically breathe out carbon dioxide. If we're not breathing out, it builds up. And that's known as hypercapnia. On top of that, it can decrease your oxygen saturation. Hypoxia, which may sound pretty familiar to mountaineers or hikers, which basically the combination of those two things causes a bit of a disturbance to the blood's acid-base balance. Now, this disturbance leads to a drop in pH level, which stimulates the body to adapt in certain ways and change certain things. That's the theory behind it, and that's kind of what people are trying to do. So now, with the theory out of the way, or just the very, very basic overview, let's talk about the claimed benefits. Let's dive into each of these ones and just explore them a little bit more. The first one I want to cover is high altitude preparation, because a lot of people, at least in the mountaineering and hiking context, a lot of people talk about breath hold training as a way to prepare for high altitude. As I said before, people sort of say, hey, this may be considered another form of altitude training. I've literally seen people say this can potentially reduce the risk of altitude sickness, and also this can potentially pre-acclimatize you, which are really big claims. Now, when it comes down to this, I think where a lot of the confusion comes from, or one of the main issues I have with this type of thing, is when it comes down to breath hold training. Some people have coined the term of this type of training, and they call it not breath hold training, not apnea training, but what they call is simulation of high altitude training, which for the general population, yeah, if you're just talking to the everyday person, cool, that's fine, whatever, that's all good. But it gets a little bit tricky when we're looking at this through the lens of a mountaineer, a hiker, or anyone going to high altitude or endurance performance. Because the name may technically, you could argue, is correct, but it can be very, very, very misleading. So to explain this and explain my kind of chain of logic here, we have to take a couple of steps back. Bear with me. Now to start, to be very, very clear, simulation of high altitude training, these breath holds, does not equal altitude training. So going up on the mountain, actually going to real altitude. Simulation of high altitude training, breath holds, does not equal simulated altitude training. Tents, chambers, masks. The names are so similar and it's very easy to get them mixed up, but in no way should a mountaineer or a hiker want to get these two things confused, to be very, very clear from the get-go. Now, let's take a step back and talk about this, because we do need a bit more background on altitude training. And we've talked about in this podcast a few times before, but I just want all this information in the right place. So, when we are talking about altitude, there are a few different types of altitude which fall under the term altitude training. Number one, we have terrestrial altitude training. This is natural altitude, going up on a mountain, getting exposure to that, training, whatever it may be. There is no doubt any type of exposure to high altitude in your training, in your preparations, in your acclimatization is going to be beneficial for high altitude mountaineers or hikers, obviously. However, obviously this isn't practical to all. If you live in Australia, where are you going to go to get altitude? If you don't have money to travel, what are you going to do? If you don't have time to travel, what are you going to do? You know, it's not practical for all. The second type of altitude training we have is what's called hypobaric altitude training. This type of altitude is simulated altitude training where essentially a vacuum, you go into a sealed space or whatever it may be, a vacuum is used to change the air pressure. So essentially we are simulating what happens at natural altitude, because that's what happens at natural altitude, the air pressure changes. This can be quite effective. There's cool studies on this showing it can be very, very effective for a lot of things. Tricky thing is, you don't get access to this. This isn't commonly available. This is for pilots or military or whatever it may be. This isn't what you may get as a mountaineer or a hiker. The third type of typical altitude training is what's called normobaric altitude training. Essentially what this is simulated altitude training where the oxygen of the content in the air is reduced, the air pressure stays the same. And the way they do this is you will be in a mask, in a chamber, in a tent, and you'll pump nitrogen into the air you're breathing in, which will change what you're breathing. Now, this is what's commonly available in tents, masks, gyms, or whatever it may be. Now, when it comes down to this type of training, we've done a couple of episodes on this already, talking about tents and chambers and this and that. There are some adaptations you can get out of this, which are similar to the type of training you would do at natural altitude. But one thing to be clear, which some people miss, is this cannot be considered interchangeable with natural high altitude. It does have some benefits, it has some similarities, but it's not exactly the same thing. Because yes, we are getting a drop in our blood oxygen, but it's coming from a different mechanism. Now, this type of training, this normobaric altitude training, does have some benefits in regards to aerobic fitness and endurance performance. Some people see some benefits for it up in high altitude, but it's like, you know, the evidence is still a little bit mixed or whatever it may be. But to be very, very clear, this type of training, it's not something that's going to fully pre-acclimatize you. It's not something that's going to prevent altitude sickness. It can give you some benefits, but whatever it may be. But the key to this type of training, and this is going to come back into relevance of what we're talking about with the breath hold, to get the best benefits out of this, to help you on the mountain, to see the benefits for high altitude, to see the benefits for high endurance performance, you want to be sleeping in a tent for over 250 hours. That's what has been seen. 250 hours is the minimum effective dose for the broad spread of people to see realistic adaptations and significant adaptations. Yes, there are some fast responders who may get a little bit, see it earlier, but if you want consistent results, 250 hours. So you have to sleep in a tent for 8 hours a night for like 4.5 weeks or 5 weeks or something like that. And it's been pretty conclusively shown that if you're training in an altitude chamber, you're probably not going to see the dramatic results you get from sleeping in a tent because it's just that time of exposure. And on top of that, even if you're training in a chamber and you're like, okay, I'm not going to see these best results from all that time in the tent, but maybe I want some improvements to my endurance, whatever it may be, the typical recommendation is you probably need about 90 minutes a week for 8 weeks in an altitude chamber, which by no means is as good as a tent, by no means is it going to give you better results, but you'll see kind of some improvements. So in summary, with this type of stuff, if you're looking at this normal barrack altitude training or any type of simulated altitude training, you need a lot of time exposed to it. And even then, it is never considered full acclimatization or anything like that. And even then, you would never say this is going to guarantee a risk of altitude sickness. So bringing it back to the original topic of breath holds, in simulation of high altitude training breath holds, we can see a drop in blood oxygen saturation showing hypoxia. If you do it, you follow the process, you've got a pulse oximeter on, you can see your oxygen saturation drop. That's where it gets the name. And in general life, for general population, if you just live at sea level, this technically can be claimed to simulate high altitude training in this specific context. Yes. But in the high altitude mountaineering, the high altitude hiking context, this definitely does not line up. Because if we see multiple hours in a hypoxic environment equal uncertain results, and you have to get 250 or more hours in this environment to get consistent results, which even then isn't considered full acclimatization, how could we consider that minutes in a hypoxic environment using breath holds, you may accumulate minutes of hypoxia per week if you did loads and loads and loads of this? How can you argue that this is going to directly affect acclimatization? You could say, hey, it's a massive, bigger stimulus, but even that, is it a massive, bigger stimulus compared to being in an altitude chamber? You may argue, hey, it's a different type of stimulus because carbon dioxide building up, but again, if hypoxia is the trigger that we're chasing here, I don't know. The only direct study I could find, which is admittedly one study and did definitely have some big limitations on it, they looked at this and they did 6 weeks of breath hold training and they didn't see any change in altitude sickness symptoms. Obviously, it was one study. You can't really make a conclusion on that. It did have limitations which are acknowledged in the study, and the protocol could absolutely be changed, but that's the evidence. So on this topic, in all honesty, breath holds are not going to pre-acclimatize you. They're not going to reduce the risk of altitude sickness. I think you can clear that off. And I don't know why anyone would ever say that when there's just no evidence there. And in all honesty, it's probably not going to replace or give similar benefits to natural altitude training or simulated altitude training. There may be benefits, it may give you some improvements, but we can't consider saying that it's another form of altitude training in the mountaineering and hiking context. So that's that. A lot of people may argue that, but I think that makes sense. Next up, let's talk about respiratory muscle strength, because this is another thing that people often say breath holds will do. Now, improving the strength of your breathing muscles, specifically inspiratory breathing muscles, the muscles responsible for breathing in, has some potential benefits for high altitude. There is some cool evidence to show that there are some really, really cool potential benefits from this. And there's some studies that look that have shown that it can delay the onset of premature fatigue of your inspiratory breathing muscles, which can happen at high altitude. So if you strengthen them up, you can delay fatigue. Cool. It can delay respiratory muscle meta-reflex onset, which is a mouthful. But essentially what happens is when our breathing works really, 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 really hard, and it gets to a point where it's like, oh my gosh, this is really, really breathing, the body's like, hey, the lungs need more oxygen. So essentially what we'll do, as it comes to a point, it hits this reflex where the body's like, I need to find oxygen, I need to find blood. So it will pull blood away from the working muscles, i.e. the legs, to the lungs. That can happen at altitude, that can happen in tough exercise, and increasing the strength of your inspiratory breathing muscles can delay this. It has shown, again, for a high altitude, can improve the clearance and tolerance of anaerobic metabolic products, can decrease perception of dyspnea, I always say that word wrong, but breathlessness, and reduce that feeling of breathlessness. It can potentially increase your blood oxygen saturation values. It can potentially improve your processing speed and working memory during exercise at high altitude. It has all these really, really cool potential benefits. Now, I'm not saying all of these will automatically happen if you increase your inspiratory breathing muscles. There needs to be more research to conclusively say that, but there are some decent evidence to show these things, which is cool. So it's safe to say that respiratory muscle strength is a really interesting area for high-altitude mountaineers and hikers. And coming back to the original topic, one of the things a lot of people say is breath hold training can improve respiratory muscle strength, and they'll say this. But in all honesty, this is a little bit dubious. Because the body of evidence, when we're looking at strengthening the inspiratory muscles effectively, similar to strength training, we need to apply an effective stimulus. We need to load up our breathing muscles pretty heavily because our breathing muscles are strong. And the body of evidence seems to suggest to effectively strengthen our inspiratory breathing muscles, we need to apply a stimulus of 30% of a 1RM or more to our breathing muscles. So an example of this, if you're doing it in the gym environment, to give you like 1RM or whatever it may be, you may be doing a squat, you may be doing a barbell on your back or whatever it may be. Your 1RM is the maximal amount of weight you can do for one repetition. So it may be, let's say, 100 kilos. Now, your 30% of your 1RM in this context would be 30 kilos. For a breathing and improving our breathing muscles, we need some way of reaching that stimuli. We need some way of loading those breathing muscles up. And this is typically, and the majority of the research is done on this, is looking at a specific device which you can load up your breathing muscles. You can get a strength training device where you literally load up with a valve and you breathe against it, and it can really, really load things up on the strength side of things. You can get a mask, and you've probably seen these elevation masks where you're kind of doing more and more, lots of little breaths to train your endurance. That's kind of where the evidence is. It's a really, really big subject, but the main takeaway is we need to load up those respiratory muscles to improve it. On top of this, like any type of muscle training, over time, we do need to progress things over time. We can't just do the same thing over and over because we need to apply more stimuli. In all honesty, breath holds probably, when you're looking at that, it doesn't really seem to stack up that it's going to be enough stimuli to reach this. And when we look at the study and the reason why people say this improves respiratory muscle strength, when it comes down to the evidence of this, when people say this has been proven by scientific studies or the evidence says this comes down to it, there tends to be just one study that people will quote over and over and over around this. And there's this one study that did show an improvement in respiratory muscle strength from breath hold training, which is cool, which is great, which is interesting. But when you look into the study, there are a lot of limitations when it comes down to the practical application of this. In the sense, when we look at the study, it was done on elite swimmers. Great. The way they did this and the way they looked at this is they had the swimmers doing their normal training program. And then what they applied was 3 30 to 45-minute treadmill running sessions per week of doing these breath holds. So already we think about mountaineering and hiking. Are we going to be able to sustain 30 to 45 minutes high intensity sessions per week? Because breath hold training is very, very high intensity. And on top of that, during these sessions, they had really, really close monitoring of what's going on in their bloods and what's going on in their body, just to make sure that they could individually adjust the breath hold training for each person to make sure the specific levels of training threshold was reached. Is that realistic for most people? I don't know. And it honestly doesn't seem to be replicated. So when we're looking at this, like, I understand, yes, there may be some evidence for it, but when people are directly and boldly saying this will prove this, there may be some benefit, but in all honesty, most of the evidence points towards a different method of training to improve this. Most of the evidence points towards using a respiratory training device for improving this. There's so much evidence to that. I don't understand why people don't talk about it more. It's really bizarre. And not to mention, this respiratory training device takes way less time, takes 6 minutes a day as opposed to 90 minutes a week. It takes less effort than doing high intensity sprints on a treadmill, holding your breath, and it won't impact your other training in regards to energy levels. So yes, there may be some evidence for this, but I don't think it is strong. I don't think it's practical to apply. And I think there are just better ways of getting this result for other people, in my opinion. Again, some people may argue that. Maybe we'll see more evidence in the future, but that's just a bit more context here. The next one is using breath hold training for carbon dioxide tolerance. And I personally think this is kind of where this type of training falls in. I personally think this is where you would see the benefits. This is why you may recommend it. And this is probably the best thing to look into because it is a really interesting subject. As a really, really simplified breakdown of this whole carbon dioxide tolerance subject. Carbon dioxide is a normal part of breathing. When we're breathing, we inhale oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. Most people know that. For our muscles, they use oxygen as part of, producing energy, producing movement, whatever it may be. And as part of that, they use oxygen, they produce carbon dioxide. As we exercise, our muscles need more oxygen, and therefore we produce more carbon dioxide. That's all pretty basic. Now, where it comes down to this is carbon dioxide is one of the stimuli which can affect our breathing. What that means is as carbon dioxide builds up in our body, this can lead to quicker breathing. And then it's quicker breathing because the body's like, hey, I want to get rid of this, which leads to less carbon dioxide because we breathe it out. So carbon dioxide builds up, the body's like, hey, let's get rid of this. I'm going to increase my breathing and then I'll breathe it out. Pretty straightforward. The theory of why carbon dioxide may be beneficial at high altitude is essentially if you have an increase in carbon dioxide in our blood, what happens is our hemoglobin is what carries oxygen in the blood. More carbon dioxide in the blood will allow it to actually release more oxygen. I'll say that again. If we have more carbon dioxide in our blood, our hemoglobin can actually release more oxygen. So the oxygen that we're breathing in can actually be better utilized from the muscles because we can actually release more, it can get more to the muscles. That's the theory. And in theory, that can be really, really good for exercise. Obviously, in theory, that could be good for high altitude. On top of that, carbon dioxide can dilate our blood vessels as well, again, helping that exchange. So both of these, in theory, could be potentially really beneficial. So the idea around carbon dioxide tolerance training is essentially we basically want to expose the body and the mind to build up a carbon dioxide. Essentially allowing the body to be less sensitive to this so we can actually build up more carbon dioxide before we have to breathe it off and hyperventilate. Now, this has two big benefits. It allows more carbon dioxide to accumulate before we have to breathe it off, leading into that hemoglobin releasing more oxygen and more blood vessel dilation. And it can also have the added benefit of basically slower, steadier breathing because we won't have to breathe quickly at certain levels. We'll have less anxiety, some people are more comfortable, and potentially better oxygenated blood because there is some evidence to show slower, steadier breathing at high altitude can improve blood oxygen saturation. In theory, that all sounds really, really, really good. And I would not argue that breath hold training can improve this type of stuff, improve our carbon dioxide tolerance. There isn't any direct evidence to link that I've seen to link carbon dioxide tolerance to performance or risk of altitude sickness. But in theory, it kind of makes sense. But there is a big caveat here. And again, the way that people talk about this, it's very, very hyperbolic. They say, if you want to improve your carbon dioxide tolerance, this is what you should be doing or whatever it may be. But there is a big caveat here because it's pretty well accepted that many well-trained endurance athletes will frequently have lower chemosensitivity, which means well-trained endurance athletes will frequently have better tolerance to carbon dioxide than people who aren't quite as trained. And these are people who have just done normal endurance training. They haven't done this breath hold training. This would suggest, when we're looking at this, that following a good, solid endurance training program, something in there can improve your carbon dioxide tolerance anyway. And there's, you could talk about this in a little bit more detail, but, that's pretty basic. It could suggest something in there that well-trained endurance athletes are doing, and that will improve things. And as most mountaineers and hikers don't, in all honesty, follow a structured, progressive, well-rounded training program following good, solid, progressive, low-intensity cardio, some slightly high-intensity sustained intervals, small amounts of super high-intensity exposure or whatever it may be, and doesn't progress over time, well, it will be logical to say just improving your normal training is probably going to be beneficial either way and give you a ton of other benefits as well. Obviously, this is a bit of a leap in logic, but does need to be mentioned. So I would sort of say if you're looking at high altitude mountaineering and if you're looking at breath hold training and you want to improve this carbon dioxide tolerance, this could be a cool tool for it. I think this makes sense. I think it's had some cool potential benefits, not to say there's direct evidence to say it'll help with high altitude, but I think this one's pretty good. Next up, EPO release. This is one a lot of people talk about. EPO, if you haven't heard of it before, stimulates the production of red blood cells. Now, EPO is produced naturally in the body. It can also be introduced artificially, and it's like part of like a banned substance when it comes down to endurance sports. And when it comes down to breath holds, specifically, breath holds have been shown to show an increase in EPO in the blood. Sounds great. The study often quoted around this is they basically say breath holds have been led to an increased EPO concentration by 24%, which sounds great. Sounds awesome. You're like, cool, 24% more EPO. That means I'm going to improve. What this study looked at, increased by 24%, peaked about 3 hours, returned to baseline about 2 hours afterwards. So in theory, with this, it's like, well, if I just regularly do lots of breath holds, then I can keep on spiking my EPO concentration, and this will be all well and good. However, that's all well and good if you're looking at this kind of one study and like, cool, that makes sense, or whatever it may be. But we have to think a bit deeper than this. Now, many studies, when we're looking at altitude training, we were talking about before, intermittent altitude training, sleeping in a simulated altitude tent, using a chamber, using a mask, they also show an increase in EPO. And they will also show a rise in EPO, often higher than 24%, often substantially higher. This is really, really common response to simulated altitude training. But what is not common, and this is one of the things I've been trying to figure out with altitude training, is what's not common is this rise in EPO always leading to a rise in a change in your red blood cells or hemoglobin. Even though the EPO is increasing, it doesn't mean it automatically will change over. And studies of traditional simulated altitude training have looked at this and come to the conclusion that changing oxygen carrying capacity in the blood, red blood cells, hemoglobin, it isn't just determined by this EPO increase, but it's really, when we're looking at this type of thing, determined by the time exposed to this stimuli, the time exposed to hypoxia. And again, if there is doubt on this EPO release, increasing red blood cells and hemoglobin from hours spent in hypoxia, the seconds or minutes of hypoxia from a breath hold seems a little bit light. And if there is doubt that an increase in more than 24% in EPO will lead automatically to more red blood cells or hemoglobin, well, there's a bit of a question mark there. There's no doubt breath holds can increase EPO temporarily, but I think people just jump on that too much and they say this happens, so automatically this leads to all of other stuff. But in all honesty, I think there's a bit more to the picture. And again, because this is such a niche topic, because there isn't a huge amount of research on it, people are making these massive jumps in logic. And I would honestly say it is dubious to think that this is going to be enough to stimulate changes which is going to help you at high altitude. I really do. Next up, let's talk about improved fitness. And we're going to break this one down to improved aerobic capacity, which a lot of people say, and improved anaerobic capacity. Now, aerobic capacity, we should all know, is the single most important aspect of fitness when it comes down to mountaineering, hiking, and also just high altitude in general. Now, it doesn't directly correspond with altitude sickness or acclimatization. You can't say, I have a better aerobic capacity, therefore I will have a reduced risk of altitude sickness. But there is no doubt it's important. Because if we build up better aerobic capacity, we'll probably have less fatigue, less exhaustion, yada, yada, yada. Now, people often say breath holds will improve your VO2 max, will improve your oxygen carrying capacity in the blood, will improve your aerobic capacity. And there are some studies out there which have shown that you can see an increase in VO2 max or whatever it may be. However, there are many studies out there that show the opposite, and these are conveniently not talked about. And ultimately, a review of studies which looked at a bunch of them and compared the good to the bad and changes to the others, basically said there is no evidence to really suggest an improvement in aerobic capacity. Now, this is obviously an area to look at because maybe there's different protocols or this and that you can put into action, but people saying this will automatically improve this, bit doubtful. And I think a lot of people, the way they use this is they kind of use the chain of logic going back to the EPO, where they say, well, it improves EPO, therefore it improves red blood cells, therefore improves aerobic capacity. And they kind of take 2 or 3 steps in logic. But doesn't seem to be a huge amount of evidence there. On the flip side, when we're looking at anaerobic capacity, so your ability at higher intensity exercise, there does seem to be a range of potential benefits on this from breath hold training. But realistically, anaerobic energy systems, it's not something most mountaineers really need to worry about. We are 95, 98% aerobic, or whatever it may be. That's a random number, but it is an aerobic sport. And I could argue that this would be really, really beneficial if you're doing something where maybe the breathing got constricted, like MMA or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, maybe rugby, maybe swimming or whatever it may be. But when it comes down to high altitude hiking, I don't know. Breath holds does have some evidence to show it improves certain aspects of anaerobic performance, but there is really conflicting evidence to show it directly helps aerobic performance. So there we go. That's just, I don't want to rag on this subject a lot because I can see potential benefits, but I really, really, really do think the way people talk about it is just super hyperbolic. And they're just really, really, really gung-ho saying this will improve all of these things, which I think is doing a disservice to the world of hikers and mountaineers. Breath hold training is absolutely an interesting area of training. It may be beneficial to do in certain contexts for certain things, but a lot of the claims, if not on most of the claims you see online in the hiking and mountaineering world, are very, very dubious. I would by no means say it simulates high altitude training in the mountaineering context. I would by no means ever confidently say it does anything for pre-acclimatization or does anything for reducing the risk of altitude sickness. It doesn't really seem it's going to reliably make a massive difference to aerobic fitness. It doesn't really seem it's an efficient way of improving your respiratory muscle strength. There may be some evidence there, but I think there's better, easier, more effective ways. I think a lot of it just doesn't stack up. My personal view on this, and people may argue this, whatever it may be, but breath hold training just isn't the magic many people make it out to be. I think, and I would really like to see over the next years, is people still talk about this subject, still promote it, still use it, but just promote it in a way that makes sense, that has evidence, and just don't regurgitate these talking points, which maybe they haven't looked into. I really do think it's something that may be worthwhile looking for some high altitude mountaineers and hikers, with the caveat that you're cleared to do this, you don't have any health conditions, if you never consider it as a replacement for acclimatization, if you are already following a structured and progressive training program and making sure you're nailing your cardio, your long steady state, low intensity stuff, your slightly higher intensity sustained stuff, your short, sharp burst, your strength training, everything like that, and making sure you're progressively building that up because you're going to get the majority of your performance increases from the basics. And do never consider this breath hold training as a replacement for anything, but it would be an addition. Also, just make sure if you're doing it, it doesn't impact or inhibit your normal training sessions. So don't use this in a way that will consume time from sessions where you could be doing something else, and make sure it doesn't cannibalize your other sessions. For example, high intensity intervals, you probably, I would argue, get way better benefits by just focusing on them as high intensity intervals. Do the sessions as they are originally designed and don't end up doing breath hold training, which may give you some small benefits, but probably lose out the benefits of the traditional stuff. The practical applications, if you're very interested in using this type of stuff, is probably in two places. I would say adding them into your warm-ups. If you're just doing some light walking to warm up, or you've done your mobility and stability in a strength session, you want to just do a few minutes of this, I can see the value of that. And also, you could probably apply this into like walking training sessions. So not so much on the trail, but if you're just doing walking around the neighborhood, if you're pack walking, if you're walking around the shops or whatever it may be, that's really, really nice, easy, gentle application of this. I think that's probably worthwhile. So with that being said, this has been a bit of a monster episode. As I said, a lot of information to cover, but hopefully that just gives a little bit more nuance, a little more context to some of this stuff, because as I said, some of those claims I've seen, it's just a bit bold. And hopefully, there's just a bit more information now out there on the subject. If you do have any questions about this, reach out. I'm always happy to help. But hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully it was interesting to a few people, and we'll talk to you very soon. Bye.